This is the business of Africa. If it's about Africa, then it's our business, bringing big and small business issues right to your doorstep. In 2015, all United Nations member states adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, widely referred to as the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. While notable gains have been made, the 2025 Sustainable Development Goals report found that, quote, only 35% of SDG targets are on track or making moderate progress. Nearly half are moving too slowly, and get this, alarmingly, 18% are in reverse, end quote. With just 4 years to go to 2030, we look at how illicit financial flows are stifling the realization of many SDGs. While IFFs impact both the global north and the global south, it is commonly known that countries in the south are disproportionately impacted. Prince Taf Mupindu is a policy and advocacy for domestic resource mobilization researcher, and he joins us for this conversation. Prince, thank you very much for availing yourself for the Business of Africa podcast. Maybe let's start with definitions. How should we understand the term illicit financial flows?
Thank you so much, Juju, for having me on this great platform. And thank you again to all the listeners who are paying attention to this. So basically, when we're talking about illicit financial flows, we are talking about money that has been illegally transferred or illegally moved or illegally hidden or hence then abused. This money technically is meant for public consumption, that is to say the social economic services, but ultimately it is misdirected and eventually it is lost from revenue streams which are supposed to be benefiting local governance.
So illegal money meant for public consumption that is misdirected. What are the sources of this illegal money?
So broadly speaking, when we're talking about the sources of illegal mining, I think the main thrust has to be corruption. Corruption, broad day corruption is the main source, and corruption of this sort happens in many streams. It could be corruption by government officials. It could be corruption by political officials representing different interests. And it could also be coming from tax evasion. When you talk of tax evasion, when you look at South Africa, it has got goods that it receives, just like Zimbabwe. Those goods are supposed to be declared, either they're entering by sea, by flight, or by road. There's a certain remittance that is supposed to be given to the local government that received those goods. So when then tax can then be evaded through, for example, we've got what you call trade misinvoicing. In this trade misinvoicing, we can either under-declare. By under-declare, it certainly means that whoever is supposed to pay a certain percentage is going to pay a low percentage than that which is deserved. And then at the same time, it can be overpriced. When it is overpriced, it can be assumed back as a kickback advantage for the specific person who imported these goods. So it can be trade misinvoicing by overpricing or trade misinvoicing by underpricing, as well as it could also be seen through drug illicit transactions. As you know, due to the porous nature of our borders, especially example in Africa, we've seen this in DRC. Zimbabwe-Limpopo border also has been having also issues to do with such illicit. So these are also sources of illicit financial flows. So they range from commodities, they range from money, actual transactions, and they also go into the digital transactions of services that can be rendered without being paid for.
What are the intended, unintended consequences of illicit financial flows? Maybe I'll use one of the sources that you speak of in terms of tax evasion. You rightfully mentioned South Africa. Right now, we are dealing with the fact that one of the major tobacco producing companies has indicated that they are going to be closing shop due to illicit cigarette smuggling in the country. And so when we speak of this, what is the intended, unintended consequences? And this is just but one example.
Oh, thank you so much for bringing out the case of South Africa. So, in essence, I'll give you something so basic that is understandable within our own sub-Saharan context, and especially within South Africa. I'll give an example of something called Universal Basic Income Guarantee, which is something basically we're saying any South African between the ages of 18 to 60 who are employable within such an age group could be beneficiaries of a certain taxation system. Now, when illicit financial flows happen, we are simply saying that the money and the funds which were meant for that Social Protection Act, the money which was meant for universal income guarantee, can no longer be accessed. Why? Because the funds have been diverted. So essentially, what happens is that the people in Makanda, the people in Soweto, are not going to be beneficiary of this taxation system, which is meant to benefit nations. I'll also give you a particular example of Zimbabwe. Supposedly, right now, our mines and gold industry is supposed to generate something within the region of 900 to 1 billion per annum annually in terms of revenue. But once the ministry notes deficiencies, it notes that there is no evidence of streams of money that can be allocated and money that can be awarded to the various sectors. Essentially, it means that there is less service provision to social services such as health, such as education, and water and sanitary provision. So basic social and economic services are denied to citizens, and individuals are then unfortunately, the beneficiaries of such a system.
What legal frameworks are in place to deal with illicit financial flows? This has been, as we said in the beginning in the introduction, that this is a problem that affects a lot of countries around the world. It's a global problem. In Africa, for instance, you had the high-level panel report on illicit financial outflows that was commissioned by the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, in 2015. What work are you aware of, at least on the African continent, that has been done to deal with this?
Yeah, so when you want to look at the framework that exists, and I'm pretty happy that you mentioned to the high-level panel report by President Mbeki back then in 2011 against illicit financial flows, that becomes a landmark in the fight against illicit financial flows, more importantly in Africa, because it is for the first time that as a continent, we more like have a consensus and agree that we should address this critical deficit of illicit financial flows. So if you look at the African Union Charter, it constitutes policies, specific policies, which are aligned to combat these illicit financial flows. And as well as if you look at the global framework that you mentioned before, you're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. If you look at goal number 16, in particular 16.4, it actually speaks to establishment of strong institutions. So this establishment of strong institutions must now cascade back to the continental region where we have the African Union, but more importantly, to the region and the countries themselves. So specifically now to Southern Africa, and then specifically to countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa. For example, I'll give you this. In the Zimbabwean framework, issues to do with illicit financial flows have not been addressed from a holistic policy point of view. They have been addressed partially. By partially, what do I mean? We've got certain legislation that talks of illicit financial flows within the resource sector. So I'll give you, for example, Section 291, Section 292 of the Public Finance Management Act of the Zimbabwean Constitution addresses issues to do with irregularities within the mines and minerals field. So as for South Africa and other Southern African countries, there has been policy initiatives, one which has been led by independent institutions such as the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI. It has been an initiative, again, for the extractive sector, which is meant for companies to voluntarily join, but once they voluntarily join, they have to adhere by the best diligence practices that avert illicit financial flows. So I will say in a nutshell, there's been a voluntary model given to governments, not enforced per se to say country A and country B must follow this type of models. If you look at Ethiopia, if you look at Nigeria, if you look at Morocco, they have adopted a sustainable framework plan that actually makes sure that investors coming within these particular nations give something feasible in terms of the economic, social, and governance return. In Zimbabwe, it's still work in progress. So I would say countries are slowly adopting to it, depending now on the level of that transparency and accountability from the parliamentary and institutional levels.
You've helped us understand that there are losers, right, when it comes to illicit financial flows, more so when you speak of less provision for social and economic services as a result of monies being diverted out of countries. Who then wins?
So I've seen this question like who wins in this trench, in this abyss of illicit financial flows. So rather than me addressing it as a global north or global south comparative, I think ultimately the winners of illicit financial flows are the enablers of illicit financial flows. And when I say enablers of illicit financial flows, I mean they are players within intra and inter. So intra, I'm referring to those players and enablers that exist within our own infrastructure, institutions that facilitate, for example, within the trade industry, that facilitate, for example, within the mining and extractive sector industries. Once we have practically, for example, porous border stations, we have enabled illicit financial flows from an institutional and technical perspective. So the enablers are individuals within the different setup. This is why you see it has been hard for us to come with a holistic approach to address illicit financial flows, because it has to be addressed from a broad view, but more importantly, it must be addressed from a context specific. In which industries are most of South Africa's illicit financial flows? You will see that the statistics from South Africa might particularly differ from those in Zimbabwe. Maybe the Zimbabwe's biggest illicit financial flows could be the extractive or the business integrity side. So we have to deal with them in sector-specific context. But ultimately, the global south and Africa at most is the biggest loser. Why? Because we provide the raw materials. We provide the play food for extraction. And when the multinational companies now realize that in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, in Zambia, there's no proper universal jurisdiction, what they do is that they do what they call subscription to countries of low tax jurisdiction. What it simply means is that one company is operating in 5 or 6 Southern African countries, but it only pays tax in the parent country, where supposedly it's Malawi, where there's low tax jurisdiction. So effectively, they don't pay or subscribe to other areas where they are making the extractive, where they are making their extraction of raw materials. So I would say that Africa and the global south are the biggest losers. However, we have to be tacit in addressing the specific illicit financial flows, because they come in different shapes. Like I gave you an example. It could be drugs that are illegally smuggled. It could be minerals that are not properly remitted. It could be simply the business industry investment plan that we are not benefiting from, because illicit financial flows emanate largely from the tax base. So we have to have a wide range spectrum view and address it context specifically.
There's always two sides of the story. What allows for IFFs to continue? Because these monies are then taken to particular jurisdictions where secrecy is a thing. We always hear of tax havens as well. And so what allows for this to continue?
So speaking from the African context, I'll be very biased in this response, in the sense that I'll be biased towards the sub-Saharan context. I'll be biased towards the global south context. Why? Most of the multinational corporations operating in the global markets, 95% of them are coming from the global north. And that is a reality. So the beneficiaries automatically, whether directly or unintended, is the global north. So who allows these illicit financial flows to continue to exist? Primarily, it is us Africans, as in our governments and our structures. Our structures have been deliberately made porous so that they benefit certain individuals. And once these individuals benefit, our institutions become weaker. So I'll say number one, there's been lack of political will. I'll give you the case of Goma. Look at DRC in the last 15, 20 years, how much resources they've lost due to war-torn resource query. And Africa, also in Ghana, due to our cocoa production, still we have not get the remittance that we deserve in terms of the ultimate value that must transform our society. So who allows the illicit financial flows to continue? Primarily, number one, it's us as African institutions, it's us as African governance. But as well, the multinational corporations have a role to play because they are the investors within our very economic setup. But I say it's Africa primarily because it is us who structure these policies. I'll give you an example right now, like I gave you an example, in terms of just energy transition. Ghana has made a commitment in terms of dedicating its critical minerals as well as other energy sources to the just energy transition. And this has led to a multi-investor approach in Ghana whereby they actually scale how much money, if they can commit 50 billion for the next 10, 15 years in terms of just energy transition, then they can start giving out structures that can manage these resources before they are disbursed. Now, the reverse is true in our African context. Resources come and we don't have structures to audit. So this is now the problem within our specific African context. So the problem lies with us, so is the solution.
Fair enough. Here's where I struggle. You look at the research, you look at the numbers, and it's trillions, if not billions, of dollars that are attributed to illicit financial flows that are sometimes, not even sometimes, that are drained out of the continent, right? And it is said that that money could have been used for sustainable development. Can we really say that? Is there a link? And I don't want to get into the exact figures, because if it is illegal movement of money, how can we really then quantify or really qualify how much it is if we don't even know how much is going out? It's just guesstimates. But is there a link between monies that are siphoned out of the continent and them being used for development? If that 1 billion that goes out, for example, of the continent in a year is then redirected towards sustainable development, can we say that that money for real would have been used for building a school, would have been used for upgrading a clinic, would have been used to make sure that people live in dignity when we look at how people live now? How long has it been? How long must it be?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So much for that. So I think we'll begin by, we may have to evaluate the cost of our inaction. It is actually appalling. Like if you look at the official development assistance which was coming to Africa prior this Trump hurricane, you could see that Africa was receiving nearly 60 billion, 45 to 60 billion per annum from official development assistance. Then you look at the amount of money that is lost through IFF, it actually exceeds that ODA because Africa on average loses approximately 90 billion US dollars per year in revenue to illicit financial flows. So could those resources and funds be used for social development? Definitely, and why not? But we come back to the same situation. We come back to the same position. It is all about reforming our own institutions and making those practices come into play. If you look at the European Union, there's nothing miraculous they do when they do their business integrity and private in partnership within their own context. Everyone has to pay their due taxes. If you go to England as an individual right now, you live there for 6 months, you've been living in Southern Africa, you'll be amazed by the amount of tax you pay. You pay 45% tax. But what does happen at the back end of society? People get their social service provision. The standard of life improves, jobs and opportunities.
And this is why nations fail. Thank you very much, Prince Taf Mopindu, a policy and advocacy for domestic resource mobilization researcher. Thank you very much for tuning into the Business of Africa podcast, where we bring big and small business issues right to your doorstep. You'll hear from us again in the next fortnight, God willing. Bahaichu, Bula.